Wherever you come from, your town almost certainly has at least one local legend or sinister event from its past. A story about something or someone with unusual, shocking, maybe even eerie details. Today, I bring you 3 of these tales from the state of West Virginia. At approximately 1 p.m. on June 22, 1932, a young man walking around Trace Mountain in Logan County, West Virginia, uncovered something horrific. Garland Davis was searching for blackberries to pick when he stumbled upon the lifeless body of a woman lying in a ditch. Davis immediately went to get help, and it didn't take long for police to identify the woman as 32-year-old Mamie Thurman. Mamie was the wife of Jack Thurman, a local police officer who worked the 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift. He noticed his wife's absence when he called her while on duty around 1 a.m. and got no answer. When he arrived home to find she wasn't there and her bed hadn't been slept in, he reported her missing. It was clear that whoever had done this to Mamie wanted to ensure her death. Her carotid artery, jugular vein, and trachea had been severed by a sharp blade. 2 bullets had been fired into her head, one behind her left ear and one above it. Her neck was broken at the second cervical vertebrae, a bone that sits near the base of the skull. Mamie's diamond ring, the money she carried on her, and the watch on her wrist had been left undisturbed, indicating the perpetrator had no interest in robbing her. It appeared that she'd been killed elsewhere and brought to the mountain in an attempt to hide the crime. Her hat was found about 30 feet away from her body. She was missing a shoe, and there was little blood at the crime scene. If police could find a suspect, there was a chance they could also find out where the real crime had occurred and gather evidence. But who would have wanted to attack a mild-mannered housewife in such a brutal way? Mamie and Jack Thurman had moved from Louisville, Kentucky to Logan, West Virginia in 1924. They found a home there in a second-floor garage apartment at 510 Stratton Street. The garage was owned by the Robertson family, who had 2 other tenants living in the main house. Clarence Stevenson, an African-American handyman and chauffeur who often helped around the Robertson home, lived in the attic. Oscar Townsend, a co-worker of Mr. Robertson, rented a bedroom. The Robertsons were well respected within their community. Harry was the head bookkeeper at the National Bank of Logan, treasurer of the Logan Public Library, and the president of the City Commission. His wife, Louise, served as the treasurer of the Logan Women's Club. Louise had befriended Mamie when she moved in and was known to take her out to the Logan Country Club for a round of golf on occasion. The Robertsons had been married for 18 years in 1932, and they had 2 children together. By all accounts, they were a happy, normal family. After Mamie's body was found, police began working to retrace her steps the night of June 21st. They were able to place her at a store near the Middleburg Theater, only about a 4-minute walk from her home, around 9 p.m. Physicians who examined Mamie's remains determined that she'd likely died sometime between 12 and 2 a.m. This left a 3 to 5 hour gap in the timeline that investigators needed to fill in. Jack Thurman, arguably the most likely suspect, was the first person investigated. Police located multiple witnesses who could verify having seen him over the course of his shift, and they felt his answers to their questions were satisfactory. He was eliminated as a suspect, and investigators moved on. They began questioning the members of the Robertson household, first focusing on Harry Robertson and Clarence Stevenson. Both men knew Mamie, but denied having any information about her death. Robertson told police that he was in bed by 11 p.m. on June 21st, and the last time he saw Mamie was 3 days prior to that, on June 18th. His story was believably unremarkable, until a shocking confession arose. Clarence Stevenson told police that he'd acted as a go-between for Mamie and Mr. Robertson to arrange meetings between them. Robertson corroborated Stevenson's story and admitted that he and Mamie had been having an affair. He said the relationship was very casual, stating that he'd only seen Mamie a few times in the last several months. The veracity of that claim is debatable, as it was later revealed their affair had been going on for 2 years. Suspicious police decided to search the Robertson home and Harry Robertson's car. Inside the vehicle were multiple areas stained with what appeared to be blood. The basement of the house contained similar stains, and a depression in one of the walls investigators believed may have been caused by a bullet. Harry Robertson and Clarence Stevenson were both arrested. The police felt that either of the men could have been the killer, but believed Clarence was the one to hide Mamie's body either due to guilt or being told to do so. Interviews of the other residents of the Robertson home were conducted and revealed even more surprising details. Louise Robertson had known her husband and Mamie were seeing each other for a long time and had begged Harry to end their relationship. She was no longer friends with Mamie, but never confronted her about the affair directly. She'd only asked her to act in such a way that if anything were to happen, the Robertson children would not face ridicule as a result. Mrs. Robertson expressed that she'd been planning evenings with Harry, hoping to keep him happy at home. She found it exhausting to maintain, as each attempt seemed to fail, with Mr. Robertson continuing to meet with Mamie. Despite her husband's betrayal, Louise corroborated Harry's story that the night Mamie died, he was in bed by 11 p.m. The plot thickened further when Clarence Stevenson confessed that he too had been sleeping with Mamie Thurman. He said they had been intimate on 2 occasions when the Robertson family were away from home. Still, he defended not only his innocence, but the innocence of his landlord as well. Clarence claimed that he'd been out past 11 on the 21st, and Harry was asleep when he arrived home. Questioned as to what he was doing out so late that night, Stevenson said Robertson had asked him to go into town and watch for Mamie to enter or exit the Holland building. According to Clarence, he sat on the steps of the Guyan Valley Bank watching the building until a few minutes after 11 p.m. He then returned home and was in bed by 11:25. With no witnesses to Stevenson's movements that night, police had only his word to go on. Though it may not have mattered if Clarence had a more convincing alibi anyways. He was a black man suspected of killing a white woman in 1930s West Virginia. There were plenty of people who had already made up their minds about his guilt. In fact, the threat of vigilante justice became such a problem that Clarence had to be moved from one jail to another while awaiting trial. There was little chance police would believe any story he told and allow him to go free without so much as putting him in front of a judge. Robertson's involvement couldn't be entirely ruled out either, though, and the investigation ended with both men being put on trial. During the defendant's testimony, Clarence's movements the night of the 21st were brought into question. The information gained from the answers may have revealed an all-new set of suspects. Stevenson was watching the Holland building because it was the location of the Logan Businessmen's Club, a key club that Robertson had taken Mamie to multiple times. The businessmen who were members would arrive at the club with their key card, allowing them access to the exclusive area on the upper floors of the building. The men involved in the club were allegedly influential in the community, and they often arrived with a female guest on their arm. Robertson claimed that during their relationship, Mamie provided him with a list of 16 of her former lovers who were members of the club. The names of these men were provided to police, but none of them were ever released to the public. All that's known about them is that one man was deceased, all but 3 of them lived in the city of Logan, and all but 1 of them were married. These details aren't much, but they're enough to indicate that all but 2 of the men Mamie named had at least one reason to want to silence her. Still, the focus remained on Clarence and Harry, and the trial continued. It was known that both men were familiar with the area where Mamie's body had been found. Robertson owned a hunting cabin not far from that very ditch. It's alleged he'd even spent time with her there. The road Mamie was found near, 22 Mine Road, gets its name from the number 22 mine that sits along it. That mine is owned by Island Creek Coal, Stevenson's former employer. When witness testimony began, the majority of suspicion fell on Clarence. Witness Myrtle Brown claims she'd been on the mountain on the night of June 21st when a man matching Stevenson's description passed her in a car with a woman. Brown said she heard 2 shots and then saw the man get out of the vehicle and stand in front of its headlights. Foremen who were traveling to work in the early hours of June 22nd reported seeing Clarence driving Harry's car alone. The local police chief and a patrolman alleged that later that day they saw Stevenson cleaning out the vehicle. There was just one piece of physical evidence to indicate Clarence could have had something to do with Mamie's murder. In his room, police had found a shirt and a pair of underwear that appeared to have bloodstains on them. The stains tested positive for human blood. Naturally, some people still suspected that Mamie's husband had something to do with her murder. Jack Thurman testified that he'd last seen Mamie at 5:30 p.m. on June 21st, just before his 6 p.m. patrol shift began. He said he was on good terms with his wife, and he had no idea what she was doing behind his back. Jack was quoted in the local newspaper as saying, "Mamie was a perfect wife to me, and I cannot realize that she would do such things as she has been accused of." Many of the residents of Logan began to view Jack as a tragic character who loved his wife. Another person of interest in the case, Louise Robertson, also took the stand. Her testimony seemed to captivate those present in the packed courtroom. Louise said she never had a falling out with Mamie, instead just choosing to stop spending time with her and treating her as a friend. Though she'd remained calm and quiet about this situation, she admitted, "I had an enmity towards Mrs. Thurman, but what was the use to be mad about it?" Today, there are questions about what role Mrs. Robertson may have played in Mamie's death. She was close to the victim and had motive to commit the crime. It's possible that Louise could have been the person who lured Mamie into the Robertson basement, attacking her while she wasn't paying attention. Clarence or Harry, with or without the involvement of the other man, might have been an accomplice in further injuring Mamie or just attempting to hide the crime. After a few months, the trial ended, and the jury reached a verdict. Harry Robertson was acquitted of all charges, and Clarence Stevenson was convicted of murder. He was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison. An appeal was made where Stevenson's attorney tried to argue that the trial was unfair because, among other things, no African American people were allowed to serve on the jury that indicted him or the jury that convicted him. The appeal was unsuccessful, and Stevenson remained imprisoned. In the many years since Mamie's death, doubts have surfaced about Clarence's guilt. Aside from the adversity he faced due to his race, Clarence may have had Harry Robertson's social status working against him. We don't know who the members of the Logan Businessmen's Club were, but we know they had power in the town of Logan. If Harry did murder Mamie, it's possible that he may have been protected by friends in high places due to his status or even their own interests in silencing her. Though it's been 92 years since Mamie's death, her story remains alive in Logan. Residents of the area believe that she hasn't been able to rest peacefully. It's local legend that Mamie still roams Trace Mountain in search of her lost head, a tale likely developed from misunderstandings about the neck injuries Mamie was found with. There have been many reports of strange sightings and sounds on the mountain too, though. A woman in a blood-stained polka dot dress has been witnessed roaming around aimlessly along 22 Mine Road. Drivers traveling on the road have picked up a woman described as wearing outdated clothing, only to have her vanish once they left the mountain. The sounds of screams and sobs coming from the area where Mamie was found have been said to echo across the surrounding hills. Some people even claim that if you park your car at the bottom of the mountain, it'll be pushed uphill. Maybe the questions still asked about the crime have left Mamie seeking justice. Or maybe the violent nature of her death has caused her to be unable to rest. Either way, it seems Mamie Thurman's spirit remains on Trace Mountain, reaching out to those who choose to visit her. Elva Zona Hester met Erasmus Stribling Trout Shue in October of 1896. Shue had just arrived in Greenbrier County, West Virginia, and was working in a blacksmith shop. Though he was said to be handsome and charming, Zona's mother, Mary, quickly decided she didn't like him. When Shue asked Zona to marry him soon after meeting her, Mary tried to convince her not to do it. In love and convinced she'd found the one, Zona ignored Mary's concerns, and the couple eloped. She left her mother's home and began living with her new husband in a small 2-story house. A short time after they married, Zona became ill. Family physician Dr. J.M. Knapp treated her, and she'd started to recover but was still in need of a little extra help around the house. On the morning of January 22, 1897, Erasmus Shue was on his way to the blacksmith shop when he stopped at the home of Martha Jones. Martha's 11-year-old son, Anderson, did small jobs for people around town. Mr. Shue asked Andy if he could go collect any eggs that were outside the Shue home, and then go inside and ask Zona if she needed anything from the store. Andy agreed to go after he finished some other tasks he'd already been hired for, making it there later that morning. Andy walked into the Shue home at approximately 11 a.m. to find Zona motionless on the floor. She was on her back, lying perfectly straight, with one arm at her side and the other laying over her abdomen. Her head was tilted slightly to the side. Andy knew right away something was wrong. He ran back home and told his mother what he'd found. She left to get Dr. Knapp while Andy made his way to the blacksmith shop and alerted Mr. Shue. By the time Dr. Knapp arrived at the house, Erasmus had already taken Zona upstairs and put her into bed. He had changed her clothing, putting her into the same high-collared burgundy dress she'd worn the day they were married. A large veil folded over a few times was placed around her head and tied in a bow under her chin. Dr. Knapp attempted to resuscitate Zona, but it was far too late. He confirmed her death and began to examine her body. There was some slight discoloration to the right side of Zona's neck and her right cheek, causing the doctor to want a closer look. He was unfastening her collar when Mr. Shue stopped him, saying he didn't want the postmortem to continue. Dr. Knapp agreed to end the exam and said he believed Zona had died of heart failure, though in her death record he lists the cause as childbirth. Zona was laid to rest in a local cemetery, and life went on for Erasmus Shue. At least for a little while. It wasn't long after Zona's burial when Mary Hester came to local prosecutor John Alfred Preston with an unbelievable story. Zona was murdered, and her mother knew exactly how and who'd done it. According to Mary, late in the night on 4 occasions, Zona had appeared to her as she laid in bed. As the stunned mother listened, Zona explained that Erasmus had flown into a rage and attacked her after arriving home to find she hadn't cooked any meat for his dinner. He was so angry that he began to choke his wife, then squeezing her neck off at the first joint, as Zona described it. Mary was completely unshakable in her belief that these visits from her beloved daughter weren't dreams. It's debatable whether or not Preston believed anything Mary told him, but he knew there had been suspicions that Zona's death wasn't natural. He decided to speak with Dr. Knapp and found out about Shue's strange behavior on the day Zona's body was found. Knapp also said that he and multiple other witnesses noticed something odd about the body while moving it. If left unsupported, Zona's head loosely dropped back and bobbed from side to side. Preston decided he'd heard enough, and Zona was exhumed so that a proper postmortem exam could be completed. Just like Mary had claimed, Zona's neck was dislocated at the first and second vertebrae. Her throat had been crushed, and the surrounding ligaments were torn and ruptured. The discoloration Dr. Knapp saw on the right side of her neck was bruising caused by strangulation. Zona had been murdered, and the only person known to have been present around the time she died was her own husband, Mr. E.S. Shue. He was promptly arrested and sent to jail to await trial. The information that came out after Shue's arrest didn't help lift public suspicion any. Erasmus was a horse thief who had spent 2 years in prison prior to meeting Zona, a fact it appears he had been hiding. He had been married twice before. His first marriage ended in a divorce when his wife accused him of great cruelty after he abandoned her and their child. The second marriage was over less than a year after it began, when Shu's wife died of a head injury. He claimed that he'd been fixing the roof of his home when a brick fell down and hit her. Her death was considered suspicious, but Shu was never charged with a crime. There were also reports that Shu had been witnessed losing his temper on multiple occasions. The trial for the murder of Zona Hester Shu began in mid-1897. The prosecution chose to focus on provable facts, leaving out Mary Hester's alleged sightings of Zona. The defense saw this as a chance to cast doubt on the prosecutor's case and called Mary to the witness stand for questioning. Erasmus's attorney repeatedly asked Mary if she was sure her daughter's visits weren't dreams. He tried to suggest that the pain caused by Zona's death might have led Mary to simply want to believe what she experienced was real. Mary never deviated from the story she'd first told John Preston. She said she had prayed that Zona would find a way to tell her how she died. Mary even testified that she'd never seen the Shu home, yet she was able to give instructions of where certain things could be found because of Zona's descriptions. The defense's attempt to turn the jury in their favor failed, as the court actually became more sympathetic to Mary. Shu was convicted of Zona's murder and sent to the West Virginia State Penitentiary in Moundsville to serve a life sentence. He would only be imprisoned for 3 years before passing away on March 13, 1900, after contracting influenza. No family came to collect his remains, and Erasmus Shu was buried in an unmarked grave in a local cemetery. Zona Hester Shu is remembered now as the only ghost ever to give testimony that convicted a murderer. In 1858, a massive construction project began in the town of Weston, West Virginia. When finished, the building would be an asylum meant to house up to 250 psychiatric patients. Following the teachings of psychiatrist Thomas Kirkbride, the asylum would be built so that patients were often exposed to fresh air, sunlight, and beautiful views of rolling hills outside the windows. A farm and dairy on the property would help ensure patients had access to the best nutrition possible at all times. It was a great transition from the prison-like psychiatric hospitals often seen at that time. Unfortunately, life in the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum would not mirror Kirkbride's dream. Things would take a much darker path, leaving a legacy that some say can still be felt on the hospital grounds today. The asylum's troubled history began with the Civil War in 1861. The structure had one wing completed with the basement and foundation for the central building dug and walled in when all non-war construction was stopped. The partially built asylum became Camp Tyler, housing soldiers and horses. There were no large battles fought near Camp Tyler, but it was raided multiple times by invading Confederate troops. When the war ended, finishing the asylum's construction became a priority. It was opened to welcome its first patients in 1864. The first few years of the asylum's operation went well. Reports from patients who were admitted at the time recalled good conditions and positive memories. Sadly, the Trans-Allegheny fell to a common problem: overcrowding. The financial benefits of accepting as many patients as possible and more made it lucrative to keep accepting admissions for a wide variety of reasons. A document released by Trans-Allegheny provides a list of the reasons some of the patients staying at the facility from 1864 to 1889 were deemed in need of treatment. The asylum treated alcoholics and opium addicts, patients suffering from grief and self-harm issues, conditions not out of place in a psychiatric facility. But there were also admissions for things like smallpox, asthma, and epilepsy, conditions that are purely medical in nature. Then, there were the patients who weren't suffering from any ailment at all. They were simply acting in a way seen as socially unacceptable for the time. This was especially true for women. The admission list provides examples such as imaginary female trouble and overaction of the mind, a term used to describe a woman attempting to educate herself. A married woman could be placed into an asylum by her husband for essentially any reason. Because those husbands were also the only people who had the authority to accept that woman's discharge, there was no telling how long her stay could be. Children were in a similar predicament. There were babies born to admitted mothers, orphans, and children who had been dropped off and left at the asylum, who spent their days there until a proper home could be found or their mother was discharged. By 1880, there were 717 patients in the asylum. The number continued to rise, reaching 1661 in 1938, and finally its maximum, approximately 2,400 in the 1950s. A 1949 report by the Charleston Gazette spoke of poor sanitation, insufficient heating, and patients who weren't receiving the treatment they needed. The patients were sharing beds and sleeping in hallways, and staff shortages were a constant issue. The conditions at the asylum were dangerous, but they weren't the only reason for patient deaths. A lack of proper supervision and the use of isolation to control patients considered unruly led to multiple murders and suicides. The belief in treatment methods now considered barbaric was lethal as well. In the 1950s, the West Virginia Lobotomy Project was developed in an effort to help solve the overcrowding problem. Lobotomies were mostly intended to treat schizophrenia and major depressive disorder, but were used for other conditions as well. The procedure was simple. An ice pick-like instrument was inserted into the brain's frontal cortex through the eye socket. Many patients never returned from the operating room. If they did survive, they were often very different from their pre-procedure self. The effects of what was considered a failed lobotomy ranged from a flat way of speaking and showing little emotion to brain damage so severe the patient could no longer provide basic care for themselves. Titus Swan, a historian who has extensively researched the asylum, estimates the number of patient deaths to be in or above the 5-figure range. Numerous patients who died at the asylum were never retrieved by loved ones. They were instead buried in the cemetery on the hospital grounds under a headstone bearing only their patient identification number. The headstones were removed, destroyed, and repurposed, and records of who the numbers belonged to were lost to time. Now, many of the bodies buried there are unknown. The mass deaths and immense trauma that occurred within the asylum have created the legend the Trans-Allegheny has become. It's gained a reputation as one of the most haunted places in the United States. Visitors and staff speak of strange noises, disembodied voices, and moving shadows while no one else is around. There seems to be a story that comes along with each experience. An allegedly real person said to have once been at the asylum that the hauntings are attributed to. One of the most famous spirits is Lily, who inhabits the 4th floor. It's said that a woman named Gladys was admitted to the Trans-Allegheny after a Civil War soldier assaulted her. The assault resulted in pregnancy, and Gladys was still admitted when she went into labor. Sadly, she didn't survive the trauma of childbirth, and her little girl was taken care of by the asylum staff. Lily was raised there until being taken in by a family. Her new home lasted only a short time though, and for reasons not entirely clear, she returned to the Trans-Allegheny. Lily spent the rest of her life in the asylum, passing away at age 9 due to pneumonia. It's alleged she never left the asylum after her death, as there are now reports of objects placed in her room moving and disappearing. She's known as a playful and good-natured spirit, with some visitors claiming to have heard her sweet laugh echoing through the halls. Also on the 4th floor resides Jacob. The Trans-Allegheny's operations manager, Rebecca Jordan, says Jacob's presence was first confirmed in an EVP during a 2008 visit from the TAPS team on the show Ghost Hunters. I wasn't able to see the episode or the recording online, but the content has been described as a man looking for his beer. Rebecca alleges that 3 years after that recording, she received admissions documents from 1890 to 1892 that confirmed one Jacob Ayers was an alcoholic admitted to the asylum. He was delusional, believing people were hiding his beer from him, and it seems he might still be looking for it to this day. Another well-known spirit at the asylum is Ruth. Ruth lived on the Civil War wing where veterans were usually housed. It was an odd place for her, considering she hated men. Ruth apparently never got past her dislike of the opposite gender. She likes to throw things at men who visit the first floor area that once was her home. Among those said to have died at the hands of another patient was Dean. Dean found himself trapped in a room with two other men, David Mason and Big Jim, during his time at the asylum. David and Jim first attempted to hang Dean, but when that didn't work, they didn't give up. They held Dean under a bed frame and began jumping up and down on it until Dean was no more. Visitors to the room the three men inhabited report feeling uneasy and sometimes even ill. Lily, Ruth, and the others are just a few of the spirits said to continue their stay at the asylum. There have been many photos and recordings taken on the grounds that believers feel are proof of their presence. But is it really the ghosts of people unable to move on? Is it that a building once filled with so many horrors holds such negative energy that it oozes from the stone itself, replaying terrible scenes from its past? Or is it all simply a figment of the imaginations of superstitious visitors who have traveled to the asylum hoping for proof of life after death? Thank you for watching. I hope to see you next time.